This is Robert Sapolsky, and you're listening to Father-Offspring Interviews.
Good day. Welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews.
Before we get started with questions, wanted to make a correction and a comment from a couple of episodes ago when discussing the Armenian genocide. And something I noted was that Turkey was allowed into the European Union despite still not being willing to acknowledge the occurrence of the genocide. A number of people noted that that was incorrect. Turkey is not in the EU and, in fact, is still waiting to get in. What actually happened was Turkey was allowed to sign a customs treaty with EU despite not acknowledging the occurrence of the genocide. The other thing is going back to that episode and reading the numerous comments. As might be predicted, there was a, how should I say it, lively range of opinions as to what should and should not count as genocide.
So, yes, we really do read all of your comments and so appreciate any corrections or cool additional info you send our way, as well as the lively debates. All right, so now for questions. Shaman from France asks, what's with the craze surrounding peptides in the bodybuilding community online? How do they differ from steroids exactly?
Oh, what a craze. What a craze. People, bodybuilders, weightlifters, power lifters. I have no idea if I've just said three different things, but people who work out at gyms these days are all agog over taking peptides, peptides to build up muscle mass so you can get all jacked and swole. So, what are peptides? Central dogma of life, ninth grade biology. You got DNA, a long sequence of DNA letters, and the DNA letters that constitute a gene specify the letters in RNA, which in turn specify the letters in proteins. What are the letters in proteins? Amino acids. There's about 20 of them, and proteins are made up of strings of amino acids where they get their specificity from, their shape, their function, and so on. Now, your average proteins are made up of about 300 to 500 amino acids, so they're long chains. The record holder is a protein called titin, which is approximately 30,000 amino acids long. So, what are peptides? They are short proteins. They're proteins, people vary as the cutoff, proteins that are less than 30 to 50 amino acids. That would count as a peptide. Now, this is going to lead me into ranting here about something about peptides. When people say they are taking peptides in order to pack on muscles, they are taking peptides means nothing at all. So, suppose you've got a peptide that consists of just two amino acids, a dipeptide, or three of them, a tripeptide, four, a tetrapeptide, anywhere up to 20, 30 or so, collectively oligopeptides. And what you got is a four amino acid word in the form of a tetrapeptide. Now, what that winds up meaning is you could look at what are possible tetrapeptides and what do they do. And right off the bat, it would seem like these four-letter words have some pretty bad connotations: kill, hate, thug, stab, ogre. So one would conclude that if one is taking tetrapeptides, that may be having some rather negative consequences. On the other hand, other tetrapeptides are four-letter words coding for love and care and home and kind and nice. And then there are other four-letter tetrapeptides coding for ibis or ibex or obex or mump, which I think is when you're just starting to get the mumps at the beginning, you have only one mump. What is this about? These are totally arbitrary. There is nothing fancy about the fact that you were taking something that is two letters long versus four letters long. Recipes and cookbooks are not coding for different types of cakes if the recipe is entirely monosyllabic or three syllables per word or whatever. This is just arbitrary stuff. So saying you're taking peptides is like saying you're taking four-letter words, you're taking seven-letter words for your building on a muscle. So people saying that, a little bit irritating. Nonetheless, why the emphasis on, instead of these 30,000 amino acid long proteins, or at least 300, 400, why are these peptides, 1 to 50 or so amino acids, why are they of significance in this case? Because when you ingest a protein or a peptide, it begins to be broken down into its individual amino acids. And in an intermediate stage, this 100 amino acid peptide has been broken down into 10 of them that are 10 long, and then further break down into 20 of them, each of which are 5 long, and you are digesting them. And it turns out small peptides of the type that people are taking when they are taking peptides, small peptides are pretty easy for getting absorbed whole out of your gut into your bloodstream without being broken down. In other words, you take some massive protein and it is not going to be in that protein form when it gets into your bloodstream. It will have been broken down long ago. You take a peptide, and a meaningful percentage of those copies of that peptide will be getting into your bloodstream unmolested, undigested. So it's a more efficient way of getting stuff into your bloodstream and onto your muscles and such. Okay, so people taking peptides, these incy little proteins that are easy to get absorbed from your gut, peptides that build up muscle in you. Peptides, we now know they could do anything on earth. They could kill, they could be kind, they could be obexes, which is one of my favorite parts of the brain, the obex. They can be arbitrary. What are the ones that people are using when they are taking peptides to put on muscle mass? Broadly, the most common is targeting the world of growth hormone. Growth hormone, you put on muscle mass, you put on strength, you put on endurance. Growth hormone is great for that. Growth hormone happens to be a protein. It's 191 amino acids long. It's made in the pituitary. And when it's secreted, it's having effects stimulating growth throughout the body. If you have a shortage of it, you may have pituitary dwarfism. If you are secreting way more growth hormone from your pituitary than is normal, you get a disease called acromegaly, which is massive overgrowth of the body, different features of it. The classic example of someone with acromegaly was Andre the Giant, wrestler actor, who was 7'4" and weighed more than 500 pounds, and as one would have predicted, died of congestive heart failure when he was still in his 40s. So, growth hormone does potent stuff to the body in terms of putting on muscle mass. And the Olympics have long, long banned athletes who have taken synthetic versions of human growth hormone. So, where is it ever useful to be giving people synthetic growth hormone? As I said, kids with pituitary dwarfism. And another realm that's kind of exciting these days is as people get older, their growth hormone levels tend to decline. And there's been a fair number of studies suggesting that if you boost their levels back up to the range of a young person, that increases muscle mass, endurance, vitality, things of that sort. But what we're mostly talking about here is people who are not going through a senescent decline in growth hormone levels, 20 somethings, 30 somethings who are taking growth hormone in order to put on more muscle mass. And what you see is it's not a great idea because it doesn't do too much. And in and of itself, it can cause a lot of side effects. So, what people in the taking peptides have shifted to is the next strategy. Rather than getting a drug that will mimic growth hormone, get a drug that mimics the hormone that gets your pituitary to secrete growth hormone. And this is a hormone that comes from the hypothalamus. Radically, it is called growth hormone releasing hormone, and it causes the pituitary to secrete growth hormone. GRH, growth hormone releasing hormone, is a secretagogue. It's a hormone that gets a gland to secrete another hormone. So the strategy is, instead of giving people growth hormone to pack on their muscle, give them a synthetic version of something that will act as a growth hormone secretagogue, will stimulate the pituitary to release growth hormone. And there's a whole bunch of synthetic versions of these growth hormone secretagogues, and they all tend to be peptides. They're on the small side. One, for example, is called sermolin, and it's 44 amino acids long, and it gets taken up to the bloodstream and it stimulates the release of growth hormone. So, what does it do to muscle mass? I don't know. It works a little bit. It's somewhat effective. What it also does is increase your blood sugar levels. It also causes fluid retention in your body. And because of those side effects and the fact that it's not terribly effective, it's banned from most professional sports competitions. So, another strategy, after your hypothalamic growth hormone releasing hormone has gotten your pituitary to release growth hormone works throughout the body to stimulate growth by way of a next mediator. It stimulates the release of something called insulin like growth factor. IGF, IGF-1, IGF-2, so on. So growth hormone stimulates these IGFs, which are the factors that actually stimulate putting on muscle mass. So another strategy, let's take synthetic long-lasting versions of these insulin-like growth factors. So there's this whole world of people taking peptides in order to tap into the growth system in the body, with varying degrees of success at putting on muscle mass, various degrees of risk of side effects. Then a whole other realm, ways by which people taking peptides are enhancing muscle mass, taking supplements of collagen. Collagen, that's a peptide. It's 19 amino acids long. Your muscles are made up heavily of collagen. Your ligaments are, your tendons are, your cartilages. Those of you who remember from a week or two ago will recall, inside your eyeball, the structure inside is maintained by a tiny microscopic superstructure of collagen. Collagen is really helpful if you're going to be building more muscle. So, the whole notion is, take collagen, take dietary supplements of collagen, and it gets into your gut, and a fair amount of it is broken down. And it's not going to get into your bloodstream working as collagen. Instead of the COL of collagen, the tripeptide fragment is now used to construct a collie protein. And the GEN at the end of collagen is broken into a tripeptide that's then absorbed and used to make a generalissimo protein. So, unless you get the entire collagen into the bloodstream, it isn't going to do much. Nonetheless, some gets in there and it increases muscle mass. It decreases arthritic pain to joints. It's relatively safe over the counter. Safi takes collagen for his aging joints. So that's one way of doing it. And of course, there is the danger of taking too much of the stuff. And what that produces, among other things, is you get thick skinned, and not in a metaphorical, but in a literal sense. Your skin gets all brittle, your joints get more brittle, stiffen. So, collagen is okay to take, and don't overdo it. Another route that people take, this hormone ghrelin. Ghrelin stimulates appetite. It is what is termed an anabolic hormone. It increases metabolism, increases appetite. It's again a peptide. It's about 20 amino acids long. And that's something else that people take. So, collectively, what can be said about these peptides that people are taking to enhance muscle tone? First, to get back to the question, these are not steroids. Steroids versus peptides. This is a chemistry issue. Steroids have a four-ring structure, steroidal rings, and steroidal hormones are made from a steroidal precursor of cholesterol, and that includes estrogen and progesterone and glucocorticoids, and most relevantly here, testosterone. A lot of bodybuilders who are abusing steroids are taking synthetic versions of androgens, testosterone. This is a completely different world. Steroids structurally are these ring structures, and they're a whole separate class of hormones. Proteins, the short versions being peptides, are these string like things. So, this is a different category. What else comes through as a theme? There's not been a lot of studies of these peptides that people are taking to put on muscle mass. So, what judicious people wind up saying is they're probably safe and generally over the counter. They're probably safe as long as you don't overdo it, and people are terribly unclear on what counts as overdoing it.
I just have to say, it's very strange to hear my father saying words like jacked and swole.
I learned it from you.
Now, Ponchit from California says, in the Olympics, an athlete has to have the requisite body parts and physical training to win. In a spelling bee, how does one train to win?
I love this question, allowing us to pair it with the previous question, competitive bodybuilders and competitive spellers and what sort of peptides go into each. Spelling bees. Big time spelling bees have Americana, happy 250th birthday stuff written all over it. Big time spelling bees have long been explored culturally. There was a great novel some years ago called Bee Season by Myra Goldberg, where an adolescent girl was turning out to be an otherworldly gifted speller while her whole driven, overachieving, neurotic family was falling apart around her and mother collapsing into kleptomania. And at the end, no, I can't tell you what happens at the end. But a very good book that was apparently made into a very mediocre movie. More recently, a movie called Definition Please, directed by Sujata Day, and that's also looking at the phenomenon of big time elite performance spelling bees. There's also a documentary from 2002 called Spellbound, which was wonderful. But probably in terms of the arts, spelling bees have made their biggest impact in the musical 25th Annual Putnam County Spelling Bee, which is near and dear to us. So, spelling bees, the big national one, the Super Bowl of it all, is the Scripps National Spelling Bee. And this is a big deal. It's for kids from in diapers, just born up until around age 14 or 15, typically eighth graders. Of course, there was that horrible scandal some years ago where that 50-year-old baby faced linguistics professor snuck in as a ringer, but it's most notable for shockingly young kids competing in this with amazing skills at spelling. It's been going on annually since 1925. 11 million kids went into the preliminary stages of the National Spelling Bee competition. Last year, for example, it's then eventually trimmed down to about 500 kids or so who wind up in the televised competition. It's covered by ESPN, which is wonderful. It's watched by millions. The winner winds up with Jimmy Kimmel, as is apparently sort of a neologism among these kids there. If you win the spelling bee, you become a celebrity. And as one of the kids in one of the documentaries explains, it's the nearest thing I'm ever going to be to a jock. So, what goes into training for it? Incredibly devoted, obsessive hard work, reading, focusing. These kids trained for years for this. And broadly, there's an old school approach and the far more trendy modern approach, which is what is mostly done these days. Old school approach. Memorization. You just memorize vast numbers of words. You live with the dictionary, you sleep with it, you are drilled around the clock by your parents, friends, delivery people, clergy. It's just drilling in the spelling of words. New school involves very little memorization. Instead, it's a process where the kid sort of derives the correct spelling from their knowledge base. Okay, what do I mean by this? Great example. I saw this in grad school when I was taking this terrifying, very intimidating biochemistry class where it was a tutorial and the person running the tutorial would say, you sitting there, come up to the board and draw this biochemical pathway. You're starting with this thing, and how do you wind up with this thing at the other end? And seeing one day, two students in the class were called up, and the first one knew every single biochemical synthetic pathway, simply memorized. He had them all there. The other guy got up and starting with the molecule, the beginning point, he just sort of reasoned his way through that, well, this is probably the easiest thing you could do at this point to remove this side part. And then it would make sense to put this part on. And he was just reasoning his way through to the end product. And as it turned out, he invented a better way of doing this synthetically. Turned out the body doesn't do that because some key enzyme in there never evolved. But that's the old school memorization technique versus deriving the correct answer. So, what does that process require? Again, intense studying, preparation, but not memorizing. Instead, these kids learn at least the starts of a number of foreign languages. They learn intensively word roots in particular from Greek, from Latin. They train year round online tournaments so that they're never getting flabby with their spelling. The old model of sitting there with your devoted parent who's drilling you is long gone. There are professional coaches, and some of these kids have multiple coaches, and the coaches who have coached winners are in high demand each spelling bee season. Also, what goes into the training for these kids, which makes total sense when you watch one of these on television, is they learn a lot of techniques for stress management and composure because this is crunchingly stressful as they're sitting there and the future of their world depends on whether or not they now say A or E kind of thing. So amid that, the kids who win the spelling bee, they tend to be very successful afterward, academic careers. They seem to produce MD, PhDs like crazy. A lot of them wind up writing training books for how to win the spelling bee. I noticed a number of them wind up being very successful as professional poker players. They appear on Jeopardy and do extremely well. So it's right around this point that a cynic would say, what a ridiculous thing to be doing, like kids training around the clock for years so they learn how to spell stuff. Just use spell check. That takes it makes all of this stuff obsolete, and that's absurd. That's like saying people shouldn't run marathons anymore because why don't they just get in their car and drive? And this contrast is, I think, increasingly pertinent in these days of AI. So what's in it for these kids? What's in it? They revel in the self-discipline, and you're constantly getting quotes from 12-year-olds who are saying, I love this. I love the work, how hard I've worked at it. And the self discipline is going to be so useful for me when I'm in med school, says this 12-year-old who usually is indeed in med school some years later. And benefiting from that, these kids love language. They love learning. They love the cultural connotations of the words. It's particularly an outpost for fairly introverted kids. And a great version of that is seen back in that musical, Putnam County Spelling Bee, where one of the characters is this terribly socially isolated, bookish girl, and she has a song called My Friend the Dictionary. And it's tapping into some of the cognitive features of frequently these socially not very adept kids of what they love about spelling. And in the song, she says, I love my dictionary and I love the indented borders. Every word's in alphabetical order. Ergo, lost things always can be found. And it also gives a social anchoring to these kids. As she sings later in the same song, the words in the dictionary are the friends I'll have forever more than the friends I've made in school. So it's a wonderful outlet for a certain type of kid's obsessiveness, and they love it and they come back year after year. And obviously, winning it is just a source of ecstasy. And in spelling bee circles, one of the famous events of it was in the 1997 national competition. The 13-year-old who won, named Rebecca Sealfin from New York, famously was over the top excited as she spelled her final word, as we can see here.
You and him.
She still has to spell it.
Eve. You. O. N. Y. M. U.
That's correct.
As I said, ecstasy, euphoria, EU at the beginning as a prefix, just like the word she spelled for winning. This is a big deal for these kids. Now, something that has to be mentioned if one is talking about big time spelling bees is the frequency with which the highest performing kids, the winners, are South Asian American, predominantly Indian kids. Over the last 25 years, about 90% of the winners have been kids of Indian ancestry. And this is really fascinating. What is this about? This is a very common pattern in a lot of these realms of very specialized expertise. The very first winner of the spelling bee, who was of South Asian descent, was named Balu Natarajan. In 1985, he won spelling the word milieu, which I cannot spell. But what happened was his was an unexpected, come from out of nowhere victory. And the South Asian American community was incredibly excited about him winning. And this inspired all sorts of kids there to start doing serious spelling, and these became community efforts and multi-generational chains of mentorship. And as you can see here, within a number of years, overwhelmingly, the winners wind up being kids of South Asian descent. And what's interesting about it is the intergenerational time. Suppose someone from your outgroup gets a Nobel Prize at age 70, and all these 10-year-old kids are inspired to do whatever it is that goes into like getting a Nobel Prize 60 years later, because the contestants are typically middle schoolers. It's a short intergenerational time, meaning once this first kid splashed on the scene and galvanized this whole community, it took about a decade or so before this became all the kids who now joined up to become obsessed with spelling. Now, this is a fairly common theme with a lot of outsider groups, immigrant groups, ethnic minorities, things of that sort, where they get caught up in some niche where they can wind up feeling like we belong, where we are no longer outsiders. Great example of this was Christy Yamaguchi, who was the first Asian American to get a gold medal in figure skating in the Olympics. 1992, followed shortly afterward by Michelle Kwan, who was another dominating figure. And it was unheard of at the time for Asian American kids, East Asian, to be figure skaters. And for the last few Olympics, time and again, the majority of the American figure skating squad are Asian American kids. And not only has this been this transition, but it has even taken on trappings of cultural pride. A lot of these competitors now are appearing in costumes that were designed by Asian American costume designers. The music they choose is reflecting traditional heritage. Where did this domination come from? People say the body type that excels at figure skating, that's more common among Asian Americans. Another thing that's emphasized is skating, getting your kid to the point of Olympic quality skating is a hugely expensive process and reflecting the fact that socioeconomically, Asian Americans in the United States are probably the most well off of any of the standard demographic groups, something the Asian community rejects strenuously as another explanation for why there's been so much success is the cliche, the stereotype of the Asian tiger mom driving her kid to excellence. But in any case, this has been a similar transition over the course of a few decades. Spelling bee excellence, now dominated by South Asian kids. Over the course of the decades, figure skating dominated by East Asian American kids, and this is a familiar pattern. For example, there is the cliche of Ashkenazi Jews who turned into violin prodigies and cello prodigies and piano prodigies, and this was a long-standing tradition, the violin playing a long role in klezmer music going back centuries or so. And this was reflecting the fact that for immigrant Jews, in lots of cases, other options were not open to them, and gravitating towards that. Bizarrely, early in the 20th century, there was a period where Jews and Irish and Italians dominated boxing, dominated pro basketball, and that period changed and shifted, but still, you've got the Jewish immigrant sort of focus on musicianship. And then we've had a cultural transition in that in recent decades, and that was mostly pioneered by Yo-Yo Ma, the world's finest cellist, who burst on the scene as the first like superstar Asian American musician. He, in fact, was born in France, but he's an American citizen. And this inspired generations of young Asian American kids to now take up the cello and the violin and the piano. And there's been this massive transition where the first half of the 20th century, classical music was dominated by the likes of Jascha Heifetz and Isaac Stern and Arthur Rubinstein, Jewish immigrant Ashkenazis. And now, the beginning of the 21st century, it's dominated by the likes of Lang Lang or Yo Yo Ma or Midori, and there's been a cultural shift with it. So, what's also interesting is seeing the potential for new versions of that to occur. It's not that many years ago that New York, and in fact the entire world, was in the throes of Linsanity for Jeremy Lin, Asian American Harvard graduate who turned around the New York Knicks in professional basketball in this one like blessed season. And this remains to be seen how much he has, in fact, inspired now generations of Asian American kids to go into basketball. Okay, so we've got the spelling bees, the training that's involved. We've got domination, as in a lot of these obscure competitive areas, by particular subgroups, very often particular outgroups, who use this as a way to feel less like outsiders. And this is a striking pattern. Now, just before ending with this, just to match the previous question, I want to rant about this, which is when you think about it, spelling bees make no sense whatsoever. English is not a very useful language. English has all sorts of multiple ways of spelling the exact same thing. There are lots of languages out there that are essentially entirely phonetic. It is absolutely clear how you spell the word based on its pronunciation. Finnish apparently is like that. Spanish, Korean. What you have in English instead is you can misspell family by spelling it Phamily, or you can have a good laugh afterward over that laff. Spelling bees only exist because of the idiocy of English having lots of redundancies in how to spell certain phonemes. Yes, no surprise, I'm a terrible speller and very bitter about youthful spelling bees.
As a cool additional observation about spelling bees, in general, spellers use various techniques when sorting out a word before officially spelling it. They'll cover their mouth or trace letters in their hands or write it with their magic foot. And in watching footage of recent spelling bees, which we did for far longer than we would like to admit in preparation for this episode, a new technique seems to have emerged among this generation, which is typing the words on an imaginary keyboard. So, a sign of the times.
Yes, forever at the cutting edge of technology.
And that's it. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of science and the beard.